April 1943. The skies over Europe roared with the engines of war, and every American bomber crew knew the odds were stacked against them. German fighters circled like hawks, waiting to tear apart the lumbering B-17 and B-24s. For months, young men climbed into those bombers, whispering quiet prayers, uncertain if they would ever see home again. The fear was real, and so was the price. Then came a machine that looked nothing like a savior. Big, heavy, and almost awkward in appearance, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was mocked by some as too bulky to fight. But when it entered the fray, the story changed. With its massive engine, thick armor, and devastating firepower, the Jug did not just fly, it endured, it protected, and it struck back with a fury the Axis never expected. For the men who lived through those missions, the sight of a Thunderbolt alongside their formation was more than reassuring. It was hope made of steel and fire. And for the enemies below, its scream from the sky became a nightmare they could not escape. If you've ever wanted to uncover the forgotten stories of these giants of the air, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because today we dive into the legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug that broke Axis skies. By the early years of World War II, the air war had taken a grim turn. Across Europe, the German Luftwaffe dominated the skies with ruthless efficiency. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs hunted bombers without mercy, and every daylight mission for the Allies seemed like a gamble with death. American crews flying into hostile airspace often did so with a pit in their stomach, knowing that many of them might not return. For those who survived, the memory of empty seats on the flight back was a constant reminder of how badly they needed protection. At the same time, the United States faced a sobering truth. The fighters it had in service, machines like the P-40 Warhawk or the P-39 Airacobra, simply weren't enough. They could fight bravely, yes, but they lacked the altitude performance and the range required to truly shield the bombers. Time and again, formations of American bombers pushed deeper into enemy territory without reliable cover, and the cost was measured in flames and falling wreckage. It became clear that something different was required, something far stronger, more enduring, and capable of carrying the war across vast skies. The demand was urgent, a new fighter that could survive the punishment of aerial combat, deliver crushing firepower, and still keep pace with the heavy bombers it was meant to guard. In this crucible of loss and desperation, the seeds of the P-47 Thunderbolt were planted. What seemed impossible, building a fighter big enough to endure, yet fast enough to fight, would soon become the very answer to the Luftwaffe's dominance. This is where the story of the Jug truly begins. And if you've ever wondered how America's air war was turned on its head, stay with us, because the arrival of the Thunderbolt would change everything. The answer to America's desperate need came in the form of an aircraft unlike anything the world had seen before. When Republic Aviation unveiled the P-47 Thunderbolt, most pilots and engineers were stunned. It was enormous by fighter standards, a brute of a machine that seemed more like a flying fortress than a nimble dogfighter. But at its heart roared the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine capable of delivering over 2,000 horsepower. This wasn't just an engine, it was raw muscle, the kind of power that could push a 12,000-pound fighter through the sky faster than many of its lighter rivals. The sheer size of the Thunderbolt gave it an advantage few could appreciate at first glance. Its thick armor meant it could shrug off hits that would rip smaller planes apart. Fuel tanks were protected, vital systems reinforced, and behind that enormous engine sat a pilot who, for once, had a fighting chance of coming home even after being riddled with bullets. Veterans would later recall the comfort of climbing into a Jug, knowing that if they got into trouble, the aircraft could take a pounding and still bring them back. But defense was only half the story. Offensively, the Thunderbolt was a beast. With 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, it unleashed a storm of firepower unlike anything Axis pilots had ever faced. In a single pass, A P-47 could tear through enemy aircraft, shred armored vehicles, or even punch holes in locomotives and bridges. To face a Jug was to face a wall of lead, and few opponents forgot the first time they saw its traces cutting across the sky. Of course, its bulk had drawbacks. Early critics complained it was too heavy, too sluggish compared to the sleek Messerschmitts and agile Zeros. But what seemed like flaws soon became part of its identity. In a dive, the P-47 could outpace almost anything in the air, screaming down at terrifying speeds before climbing back with its monstrous engine roaring. The very weight that seemed like a burden turned into momentum, a weapon in the right hands. This unlikely combination of strength, firepower, and survivability made the Jug far more than just another fighter. It was a guardian and a predator rolled into one. And once it entered combat, it proved that size and resilience could triumph in the deadly chess game of aerial warfare. Stay with us, because the next chapter reveals how this giant, once doubted, would carve its legend in the skies over Europe. When the P-47 Thunderbolt finally took its place in the skies over Europe, the men who flew in the lumbering formations of B-17 and B-24 felt an immediate shift. Until then, every daylight raid into German territory had been a terrifying ordeal. The Luftwaffe's fighters swarmed in, cutting through bomber formations like wolves attacking a herd, and losses piled up mission after mission. Crews called these flights suicide runs, and many wondered how long the strategy could continue before America simply ran out of men and machines. The arrival of the Thunderbolt began to change that grim equation. At first, bomber crews were skeptical. This new fighter looked too big, too heavy to keep up with the nimble German interceptors. But when the Jugs roared into battle, doubts vanished. The P-47's immense radial engine allowed it to climb to the same high altitudes where bombers flew, and once it got there, it proved more than capable of taking on Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Its speed in a dive was unmatched, turning every Thunderbolt into a predator that could swoop down, strike with overwhelming firepower, and then climb back out of reach. Pilots called this the boom and zoom tactic, and it played perfectly to the Jug's strengths. The psychological effect was immediate. German pilots who had once attacked bombers with confidence now found themselves ambushed mid-dive by Thunderbolts dropping like thunder from above. Bomber crews, who used to watch helplessly as their comrades fell in flames, now cheered over the intercom as P-47s cut through enemy fighters with streams of .50 caliber tracers. For the first time, those men felt they had guardians in the sky, and it transformed morale as much as it altered strategy. The statistics told the same story. Missions that once cost dozens of bombers now saw significantly fewer losses. Thunderbolt groups claimed thousands of German aircraft destroyed, both in the air and on the ground, tipping the balance of air superiority away from the Luftwaffe. And while the Germans still fielded skilled aces, the relentless presence of the Jug meant they could no longer dictate the terms of battle. Instead, American pilots were now the ones choosing when and where to fight. Veterans often remembered the Jug with a kind of reverence. Some admitted it wasn't the prettiest plane, but they swore it was the toughest. Stories spread of pilots limping home, with wings shredded, engines smoking, and fuselages riddled with holes. Yet the P-47 still delivered them safely back to base. It became known not only as a fighter, but as a lifeline, a machine that gave its pilots and the crews they defended something priceless: hope. And this was only the beginning. As the war in Europe escalated, the Thunderbolt's role would expand beyond protecting bombers. But before we get there, pause for a moment. If you were one of those bomber crewmen in 1943, wouldn't you have felt a surge of relief seeing those hulking Jugs sliding into formation beside you? Share your thoughts in the comments, because for many men back then, that sight meant the difference between life and death. While the Thunderbolt had already proven itself over Europe, its story did not end there. Thousands of miles away, another war raged across the vast Pacific. Here, the challenge was entirely different. Endless. Stretches of ocean, tropical heat, and a cunning enemy in the form of the Japanese Zero. Where the Luftwaffe relied on altitude and speed, the Zero relied on agility, its light frame able to twist and turn with astonishing grace. Many wondered, could the heavy Jug, with its bulk and brute force, survive in such a radically different arena? The answer came quickly. Though the Zero could outturn a Thunderbolt in a tight dogfight, it could not match the Jug's resilience or its devastating firepower. Pilots soon realized they did not need to dance with the Zero. They could outlast it, outgun it, and rely on the Thunderbolt's ability to absorb punishment that would have torn lighter aircraft to pieces. Again and again, American pilots walked away from missions in aircraft riddled with holes, living proof that the Jug could take what the Pacific skies threw at it and still come home. In the islands of New Guinea, the Philippines, and beyond, Thunderbolts began carving out a reputation not just as fighters, but as survivors. The men who flew them grew to trust their machines in ways few words could capture. To them, the Jug wasn't just a weapon. It was a partner in survival, one that gave them the courage to fly into danger knowing they had a real chance of coming back. This was the Pacific Theater's great lesson. Even against the famed Zero, the Thunderbolt had a place, and it was a place earned through sheer toughness and firepower. And as the war pressed deeper into Japanese territory, the Jug's role would evolve yet again, becoming more than a guardian of the skies. If you followed us this far, stay with us, because the next chapter reveals how the Thunderbolt turned into a terror for enemy forces on the ground. If the skies of Europe and the Pacific had proven the Thunderbolt's worth as a fighter, its true legend was written in fire and smoke on the ground below. The P-47 was not only a shield for bombers or a match for enemy aircraft, it became one of the most feared ground attack weapons of the entire war. In fact, many veterans would later say that if you really wanted to see what the Jug could do, you had to look down at the scorched battlefields of Europe. The Thunderbolt's design made it uniquely suited for this brutal role. Its heavy frame allowed it to carry an arsenal that rivaled some light bombers. Bombs strapped under its wings, rockets armed and ready, and always the 8.50 caliber machine guns waiting to unleash hell. When a formation of P-47s came screaming down over rail yards, convoys, or tank columns, it was as if the sky itself had turned into a hammer, pounding the Axis war machine into pieces. Soldiers on the ground gave the Jug a reputation that spread in whispers and fear. They called it a flying tank, not only because it could take hits, but because it could destroy almost anything it targeted. German forces quickly learned to dread the sight, or even the sound, of the Thunderbolt. Its massive engine produced a deep, guttural roar that echoed across valleys and towns. To Wehrmacht troops, that sound meant their trucks, trains, or armor might not survive the day. Countless accounts describe entire supply lines ripped apart, bridges collapsing under thunderous strikes, and tanks left smoldering husks after rocket and gun runs. The psychological effect was nearly as devastating as the physical destruction. Facing the Jug wasn't just dangerous, it was demoralizing. The numbers speak volumes. By the end of the war, Thunderbolts were credited with destroying thousands of vehicles, trains, and artillery pieces, along with countless fortified positions. They disrupted supply chains, crippled transportation, and left enemy units scrambling to regroup. It was the relentless pressure from above that made life on the front lines nearly impossible for German troops. One veteran later remarked, "If the Thunderbolts were in the area, you couldn't move in daylight without risking your life." For the pilots, flying these missions demanded courage of a different kind. Dogfights might last minutes, but ground attack sorties meant plunging low into a storm of flak, gunfire, and danger from every direction. Pilots often described the battlefield as a wall of black smoke and fire, with explosions rocking their aircraft as they pressed home each attack. Yet time after time, the Jug brought them back, scarred but alive, ready to fly again. This was the transformation of the Thunderbolt, from a heavyweight brawler in the skies to a relentless executioner on the ground. And for the Allies pushing across Europe, it was a game changer. The Jug didn't just win dogfights, it helped win battles, If you believe the ground pounders deserve as much credit as the dogfighting aces, hit that like button, because the Thunderbolt's legacy on the battlefield deserves to be remembered just as fiercely. And as we continue, you'll see how the stories of the men who flew it turned the Jug into something even greater than a weapon. They made it a legend. Behind every roar of the Thunderbolt's engine was a man strapped into the cockpit, facing dangers most of us can scarcely imagine. The Jug's reputation wasn't just built on statistics or factory blueprints. It was forged through the experiences of pilots who pushed it to its limits and lived to tell the tale. Their stories reveal not only the machine's strength, but also the courage and resilience of those who flew it. Take Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, for example, the top American ace in the European theatre. Flying the P-47, Gabreski racked up an extraordinary number of victories against the Luftwaffe, becoming a symbol of skill and determination. He often credited the Thunderbolt's power and durability for giving him the confidence to engage even when the odds looked grim. To men like him, the Jug wasn't just an aircraft. It was a trusted partner in the deadly game of survival. Then, there was Robert Johnson, whose story became legendary among his peers. On one mission, Johnson's Thunderbolt was struck by more than 200 rounds of enemy fire. His canopy was shattered, his controls barely responsive, and flames licked at the fuselage. Any other fighter would have gone down in flames, but the Jug refused to die. Against all odds, Johnson nursed the crippled machine back across enemy lines and landed safely. When he climbed out, shaken but alive, his comrades looked at the battered P-47 and realized just how indestructible it really was. Stories like these spread quickly through airfields, carried in hushed voices and wide-eyed retellings. They weren't just tales of survival, they were proof that the Jug could deliver its pilots home even in the darkest of moments. And that knowledge gave every man who climbed into the cockpit a little more courage, a little more hope. It is these human stories that breathe life into the history of the Thunderbolt. They remind us that behind the metal and firepower were young men who relied on it to keep them alive. And as we continue this journey, ask yourself, if you were in their shoes, flying into danger day after day, wouldn't you want a Jug watching over you? Share your thoughts in the comments, because these stories deserve to be remembered as more than history. They deserve to be honored. For all its power and resilience, the Thunderbolt was not without flaws. Pilots loved its toughness, but they also knew its size came with limitations. In the close-in, twisting dogfights where agility meant life or death, the Jug simply couldn't match the nimbleness of lighter enemy fighters. Many young aviators learned quickly that trying to turn with a Messerschmitt or a Zero was a mistake that could cost them everything. Instead, they had to rely on the Jug's strengths, its speed in a dive, its ability to absorb punishment, and its devastating firepower. Another challenge was range. Early models of the P-47 simply couldn't escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Missions over Germany often stretched beyond the Thunderbolt's fuel capacity, forcing commanders to look for alternatives. This gap eventually gave rise to the Mustang's fame as a long-range escort, while the Jug found its greatest calling in ground attack. Still, engineers and pilots weren't content to leave it there. They pushed for improvements, and out of those efforts came the P-47N, with larger wings and extended fuel capacity. This variant finally gave the Jug the legs it needed for long-range missions, particularly in the vast Pacific theater. The story of the Thunderbolt's limits is also the story of adaptation. Instead of giving up on a too heavy fighter, the Allies embraced its strengths, worked around its weaknesses, and refined it into a weapon that shaped the outcome of the war. That balance of imperfection and ingenuity is what makes the Jug such a remarkable machine. And as we'll see next, its relationship with the Mustang wasn't one of competition, but of complement. When people talk about American fighters of World War II, two names rise above all others: the Mustang and the Thunderbolt. They were different in almost every way, yet together they became the backbone of Allied air power. To compare them isn't to crown one a champion and dismiss the other. It is to understand how two very different machines could complement each other in a fight for survival. The Mustang was sleek, fast, and built for endurance. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and remarkable range, it could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have the fuel to dogfight on the way home. Its agility made it a favorite for pilots who craved the feel of a nimble, responsive machine. For bomber crews flying into the heart of the Reich, the Mustang's silhouette overhead meant hope, because it could stay with them from start to finish. The Thunderbolt was something else entirely. Big, heavy, and armed to the teeth, it wasn't built to dance. It was built to strike and to survive. In the air, it could dive faster than anything the Germans had, and on the ground, it was unmatched in sheer destructive power. Where the Mustang stretched its wings to cover the skies, the Jug slammed its weight against enemy armor, trains, and strongholds. In truth, it wasn't Mustang versus Thunderbolt. It was Mustang and Thunderbolt. One shielded the bombers across impossible distances. The other hammered the enemy's war machine into dust. Together, they gave the Allies exactly what was needed to win the skies. So, which do you believe was the greater plane? The elegant Mustang or the indestructible Jug? Share your thoughts below, because every opinion keeps this history alive. The war eventually ended, but the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt did not stop when the guns fell silent. Even after Germany and Japan surrendered, the Jug continued to serve in the air forces of nations around the world, proving its worth in new conflicts such as the Korean War, where it flew under the name F-47. Its longevity was not an accident. The Thunderbolt's rugged design, immense firepower, and ability to absorb punishment made it one of the most reliable combat aircraft of its era. But its true legacy is not just written in the number of missions flown or the targets destroyed. It lies in the lives it saved and the hope it inspired. Thousands of bomber crews owed their survival to the Jug's presence, and countless ground troops advancing through Europe and the Pacific found courage in the thunderous roar of its engine overhead. The men who flew it often spoke of the Thunderbolt not just as a machine, but as a companion, one that never gave up on them, even in their darkest hours. Today, when historians call it a flying tank or a workhorse of the skies, they are capturing more than just a nickname. They are honoring a symbol of resilience and strength, a reminder of what happens when ingenuity and determination meet in a moment of history that demanded nothing less. So as we close this journey into the world of the Jug, take a moment to reflect. Would the war have looked the same without its shadow in the skies? And if you want us to keep bringing these stories of courage and machines that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and join us in remembering.